Welcome back to Late Night Lamentations. Does God Feel Pain? Episode 4. Rinsed, Not Clean. 1 Samuel 15:11. It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me, and hath not kept my commandments. So if we pick up where we left off in episode 2, the cycle, the book of Judges ends with that line that we mentioned. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. The exposition portion of this episode will briefly discuss how we got from there was no king to Israel has a king now, but
something still ain't right.
Before jumping into 1 Samuel, we already know a few things up to this point. We know about Israel's cycle, this continual pattern of trusting God and forgetting about Him. We know that there were roughly 12 judges. There are some that are split between major and minor judges, but each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses in terms of their abilities to both deliver Israel out of their suffering and in terms of their abilities to do right in the eyes of the Lord. And we know that there's still war with the Canaanites due to the aforementioned failure to adhere to God's specific commands before Israel settled into their new home. When we open the book that follows Judges, we're introduced to the final judge, that being Samuel. There's his whole origin story where the book will further build on the ideas we've already been discussing, how Israel has continually moved towards a place where their leadership fails to recognize the core of what it means to follow God by way of outward portrayal rather than inward identity. In chapter 4, the children of Israel are attacked by a neighboring nation, the Philistines. Now, these people have been mentioned before in the book of Judges, prominently within the story of Samson, but you don't have to think too hard about who these guys are since they're still technically Canaanites. They just come from a different region of Canaan than the other enemies that have already been mentioned. It had to be a place where there was something in the water or something like that too, because as the Bible describes some of them as giants, particularly in the case of Goliath later in this same book. And we probably won't get there with this episode, but you should be reading or whatever. Anyway, Israel loses the Ark of the Covenant due to them misusing it in battle with the Philistines. Back it up a bit, because we didn't really talk about what this thing was in the previous episodes to my knowledge. The Ark of the Covenant is described in Exodus 25 as the place where God says, I will meet with thee and commune with thee from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubims, which are upon the ark of the testimony, of all things which I will give thee in commandment unto the children of Israel. This is the physical representation of the presence of God within the nation of Israel. We'll see it mentioned in the book of Numbers as always being something that goes before Israel, showcasing that God is leading and the people are following. Inside the ark itself, we read in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy that the tablets of the law, a jar of manna, and Aaron's rod that budded are placed, representing the covenant memory in physical form. We keep going into the book of Joshua, and in chapter 3, we'll see it used to allow Israel to passage through the Jordan River. This is something that isn't talked about too much, but really should be. It should be just as up there as the parting of the Red Sea back in Exodus, after all the 10 plagues were done. But anyway, later in this same book, the ark is part of the fall of Jericho, being carried around the city 7 times before the walls fall. Remember that whole thing about cities will fall to music? It's mentioned there too. But all right, so that tells us what the ark is, but what else do we know? Well, the ark is interestingly absent from being mentioned throughout the book of Judges. Back in Joshua 18, we see that the tabernacle is set in a place called Shiloh, so we can safely assume that the ark resides there as well. But after that passage, we don't hear about it again until 1 Samuel chapter 4. This checks out with what we already know, as the idea of Judges as a whole representing Israel's misalignment with God and His will. It's directly reflected by the fact that this manifestation of God leading the way of Israel just isn't their focus at the time. The first 3 chapters of 1 Samuel further describe this disconnect between Israel and God. Eli is introduced as the head priest, and while he isn't necessarily the worst of the worst or anything like that, what good he does here is overshadowed by the sins of his sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These men were supposed to take over after Eli passed away, but instead of walking after the steps of God, they're described here in 2:12 that they knew not the Lord. Eli himself appears to be just someone who inherited the priesthood. He doesn't have a burning bush moment like Moses, a prophetic calling, or a consecration ceremony. And that isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but where we see the root of the issues of his sons is here in verses 22 through 25. Eli hears about how his sons have been stealing from sacrifices, exploiting worshipers, and committing sexual immorality at the tabernacle entrance. And when he hears about all this, he slaps them on the wrist. He verbally reprimands them. He doesn't strip them of their authority. He doesn't kick them out of the congregation. He just tells them, hey,
Don't do that, that's bad.
and then he leaves it at that. This shows a lack in faith on Eli's part, and really cements the idea we're building towards here in this episode. It's not even completely a lack of faith, it's like a lack of respect for the faith, I guess, in a way. But Eli is the first representation of being rinsed but not clean. On the outside, he seems like he's doing okay. He's keeping the porch swept and the windows of the house clean. But once you look deeper inside, the cracks of the foundation begin to reveal themselves. So this makes sense to me why someone like Samuel had to replace him, both Eli and his sons, if Israel was ever going to get back on track to following God. And that's exactly what happens. In the same passage of chapters 2 through 4, God tells Eli that he and his family are done in terms of being the billboards for Israel to look towards for repentance with God and direction, really. Samuel even gets told by God himself, and I think he's like close to the age of a kid, like he's still in training to be, he doesn't know he's in training to be a prophet, but he's studying underneath Eli when he gets told this whole thing. Have you heard this before? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. This whole, here am I, Lord, and then Eli says, I didn't actually call you. It's like this stuff in the middle of the night. Anyway, that's where we're at, if you're familiar with that story. Anyway, Samuel even gets told by God himself that he will become the prophet that will communicate God's will towards the people, going forward. When we get to the thing that we mentioned earlier about the ark being stolen by the Philistines, this is God's plan in action. During this battle, the sons of Eli die, and Eli hears the news of these events afterwards, and he himself perishes. It's actually interesting, too, because some guy runs up to Eli, and at this point, he's very old. He can't see. He's blind. That's how old he is. And he hears, shouting and stuff going on outside, and a messenger runs up to him and breaks the news to him. And the order that he breaks the news in is he goes, your sons have both, Israel lost, your sons have both died, and the Ark of the Covenant's been stolen. And it even says, when he had heard the Ark of the Covenant been stolen, that's when he ends up, I think he stumbles over something and falls and breaks his neck and dies or something like that. But, I don't know. There's not really a point to be made there, just, that's what happens. Chapters 5 through 6 talk about what happens to the ark while the Philistines are keeping it safe in their camp. I won't spend too much time on it here, or I'll do my best not to, but they hold on to it for 7 months. And during this time, the ark begins to mess with the Philistines' false god of Dagon. If you decide to make time to look at it for yourself, it's actually pretty funny how they keep setting the statue up in the tent where the ark is at the same time. Then they come back and they check on it another day, and something's happened to the statue. But, it goes on to talk about how after the Philistines keep messing with it, the ark continues to afflict the people. And so they move it around to different cities to get it to stop, but it doesn't. And so they end up just giving it back to Israel at the end of chapter 6. But to reframe our focus before moving on here, all of this is making sense. All of this lines up with what we already know. If Israel's heart problem is still as evident as it has been in the last 2 episodes of this series, why would doing something like bringing the ark to battle in Samuel 4 even do anything? Israel wanted the benefits of God's presence without submission to his holiness. When I was putting this episode together initially, I was confused by this section because so much happens so close together. You've got Samuel being told that he's going to take over as a leader. Then Israel hears that this is the case, and then they go to fight the Philistines, and they lose. And then after the loss, the elders decide, instead of going right to Samuel, or right to God for that matter, about what to do, they instead lean on a false interpretation of their tradition and try to just use the Ark of the Covenant as a weapon against their enemies. They bring it out to battle, and they start chanting like this is some pagan superstition, and even though this scares the Philistines, it doesn't stop them from fighting, and it might even actually rile them up even more. I don't know, that's speculation, but Israel loses a ton of men on top of the Ark itself in that second battle. Then you get 2 chapters of the Ark moving around like Philistine territories before going back to a place called Beth Shemesh, where the Israelites first see it. They rejoice, and they offer sacrifices to God on it. So this is all getting better, right? This is all good stuff, it seems. But when you get to chapter 6, verse 19, it describes the Lord smiting 50,000 and 70 Israelite men due to them looking into the ark, like after they do the sacrifices. And it seems a bit harsh on the surface, I think, but I think it represents the thing that we've been talking about here up until this moment, that God isn't playing games with these people, with the Israelites anymore. And with Eli gone and the ark returned, people need to respect the God that's been in control the entire time. And they should already know this. This is not Exodus, Numbers anymore. This is we are in 1 Samuel. There have been a lot of books before now. There's been a lot of time passed. We're back in like a history type of book now. You know how last episode was the Psalms and we had to bounce around a little bit? We're back in a linear history again. They should know this. But anyway, after the Israelites get wiped out, their first reaction is not to fall on their faces in repentance and ask for forgiveness. They just move the ark again. They choose to reject God's holiness instead of trying to become one with it like they have in the past. Now when they move it this last time, everything is fine after that. They put it in its right place, they give it the respect it deserves, and they start doing things right again. But Chapter 7 opens up with another time skip, stating that it has now been 20 years since the last event that we just talked about happened, and the children of Israel begin to lament after the Lord. So maybe I kind of misspoke when I say things start to get better. They kind of just stagnated after the ark was put where it ended up resting after that. Anyway, Samuel is finally being asked to do something by the people, and upon this happening, he begins to get the people back on track. They put away their false gods, and they spend some time in prayer and fasting at a place called Mizpah. The Philistines hear of this and all this ruckus and going on, all this prayer and fasting and worship, and they begin their next assault. Israel hears the enemy coming, and they become afraid, which is pretty interesting because, so when you guys were far from God, it was, and using the ark as a weapon, it was all shouts and boasting. But then you lose, right? But now that you're close to God and you're doing things with the right heart again, you're afraid? It's just interesting. But they plead with Samuel to continue his prayers to the Lord, acknowledging that God is the only thing that will be able to deliver them from this upcoming battle. Especially since they're not ready for war. They've been praying and fasting. They're exhausted. They probably don't even really have weapons around them. But speculation, I suppose. Sure enough, that's exactly what happens, right? A group of unarmed, tired, and hungry people are able to both win this battle and take back their stolen land due to the power of the God that they serve. They don't get all of it back now, but that's where we're going, is that they're going to continue to, whatever, spoilers. Anyway, this is great, right? Awesome. Israel is again back on track where they should be. It's really good. It should be smooth sailing for at least a chapter or 2 by now, right? Wrong. Chapter 8 opens with Samuel being described as old, and that he had made his sons to be the next judges over Israel. I want to say like father, like son here, since the chapter will go on to describe Samuel's sons in the same way that Eli's were, i.e. being the complete opposite of their father in terms of how they serve both God and the people of Israel. I want to say that, but Eli technically wasn't Sammy's dad. Eli was just the high priest at the time that taught Samuel. But it is interesting here that this parallel exists. What does Samuel do when he finds out that his kids are, for lack of a better word, unqualified for this religious leadership that he's, trying to train them for? He removes them. Yay! How do we know that he removes them, though? We kind of have to cheat, and we got to kind of look ahead, where are we looking ahead, though? Look at the wording on both of the following verses, okay? In chapter 8, verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel." Then it goes on to talk about them. We skip ahead to chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. Samuel reflects on the events that we haven't gotten to just yet in this episode, saying, "I have hearkened unto your voice, and have made a king over you. And now behold, the king walketh before you, and I am old and gray-headed. And behold, my sons are with you, and I have walked before you from my childhood unto this day." Samuel's sons are no longer over Israel, being in places of leadership. They are now among them in the crowd. I just thought that should be highlighted here. Samuel is regarded in the same light as Moses in some circles. And it makes sense to me why that is. And it probably will to you too if it doesn't already, the more that you read about his actions and behaviors in this book. But, more on that later. Maybe. I just wanted to showcase that here before I forgot. If we go back anyway, so 1 Samuel 8. 1 Samuel 8 describes the beginning of earthly kings in the kingdom of Israel. Samuel up to this point has done a good job of judging the people, not in the way that we judge others today, in a way that of being one with the culture itself, while simultaneously being one with the God whom they serve. Essentially, as a prophet, God speaks through him to instruct and direct Israel at different points to ensure that they stay on the right path. There's probably a lot more detail we could get into about what exactly a prophet does or what they serve as, but the point I'm getting to is that Sam has done well with both serving God and communicating God's desires to the people around them. In chapter 8, Samuel begins to start growing those gray hairs and starts getting his two sons, Joel and Abiah, ready to take over after he passes. The problem is the people begin to notice that Samuel's sons aren't like him. They don't follow his ways, and they love money, taking bribes, and perverting judgment. This is a good thing that they notice this, by the way. It should be noted that it's not their recognition of a problem that's bad here, it's their reaction to the knowledge that becomes the problem. And that they, in this last sentence and a half, has been Israel, right? Like, it's good that Israel has recognized that this is an issue. The elders of Israel gather into a mob of sorts, and they confront Samuel about the situation, demanding that he fix this problem by giving them a king to judge us like all the nations. Instead of confronting Samuel on his personal decision to make his sons the next to take over, since it isn't stated here that God told Samuel to make his sons do so, and if we follow the pattern of how judges actually become judges themselves, it isn't through lineage, it's through God's revelation and instruction. Israel decides that they've had enough with this whole living by faith in God thing, and that it's time for them to have something that resembles the world they're being taught how to be separate from. Samuel gets mad at this, like this confrontation or this assertion about wanting a king, and the first thing that he does is go into prayer with God about it. There's definitely something to say about that initial reaction that speaks to Sam's character. But to avoid too many distractions from the overall episode today, look instead at what happens in the next two verses. God explains to Samuel that this is not a rejection of him as a prophet, but it's a rejection of God as their true leader. Even after all that he's done for them through the Exodus era, beyond and before it, they continue to desire to serve other gods over the one who loves them most. Instead of getting angry and dropping another flood on his people, God says to go ahead and let them do it. But when you do, make sure you give them the full gravity of what it is that they're asking for. So Samuel obeys and repeats the message back to Israel, breaking down exactly how this will go. Similarly to how God tells Adam and Eve that, yeah, you can technically eat the apple, but this is what it's going to lead to if you do. In choosing a king in choosing a king on earth to rule them, they are signing up for all that comes with it. Kind of like when Jafar wishes to become a genie in Aladdin. Instead of an eternity stuck in a lamp here, Israel can expect to pay tithes or taxes to the king on a regular basis, have their sons conscripted, for war, sign them up for war type thing, used in labor for things from working fields for the king's benefit to larger construction projects. their daughters given to the king to be bakers, cooks, and confectionaries. The king will take their fields, vineyards, olive yards, and the best of what you have in terms of both properties and your sons as well, and a tenth of your sheep. And you'll also be his servants. All of this will eventually come to a point where you can't take it anymore, and you're going to cry out to God, and he won't hear you. Think about this for a quick second, okay? Israel rejects God even after all that he's done to get them into the promised land. Israel hears essentially right from God that he not only sees what they're doing here, but basically confronts them about what going down this path would mean for their future. And he lets them choose anyway. He doesn't force them to change their minds. He doesn't punish them for deciding to go this route, at least not right away. And I would argue not at all, really, since he's just telling them what earthly kings will do to them, and it's really on them when the bad stuff begins to really set in for their future generations. And I don't even know if we'll really get there in this series, but if you don't believe me, read 1st and 2nd Kings. It's a mess. But he lets them choose because the love that he desires to have is not a feeling that is robotic and lifeless like Brainiac from DC or something. It's something that depends on the sender's motivation, not the recipient's reciprocation. It's easy for me to smack my forehead reading passages like these, saying things like,
You dummies!
But, we didn't even talk about this other tangent that I'm going to include here in two episodes ago in Judges. But this isn't even the first time that Israel has tried to make an earthly king for themselves. If we look back in Judges chapter 8, verses 22 through 23, they ask Gideon, who's another judge, we didn't talk about him, they ask Gideon to be a king for them, and he refuses, stating that, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Which is great, good job, Gideon. That is a righteous response to an unrighteous people. Except that you named one of your sons Abimelech, which literally means my father is king in Hebrew. So when Gideon dies, Abimelech has been hearing, my father is king, my father is king, his entire life when someone says his name. And he starts to think to himself, well, if my father was king and now my father's dead, guess that means I get to be king now, And he brings this idea to the people who absolutely love it. Great job. Great idea, Mr. Abimelech. Of course, you're going to give us exactly what we want. But anyway, this guy starts a civil war within Israel and ends up going just as you'd expect it would. People are killed for awful reasons, and God has to send another deliverer to clean up the mess. So after adding this piece into the context of what was mentioned a second ago, regarding Israel telling Samuel that they want a king again, it feels like a slap in the face. Sometimes the Bible feels like it's just like a repeating sentiment of those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat it. How many times have I read? Again, it's easy to point fingers. It's really easy to point fingers here at Israel. But how many times have I read about God warning about a particular lifestyle and its effects on what it'll do to me, and willfully decide to go with what I think I needed anyway, instead of listening to him? How many things am I currently wrapped up in now, in my own life, that are a result of not giving reverence to what I've grown up hearing since I was a child? It's all around, it's heartbreaking. If God acted any other way than what's described in this specific story and in others that showcase his attitude and behavior concerning love, it would make me question his character. But he doesn't change. He doesn't lie. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. We'll continue on now, but in case you're curious about if this prophecy of how Israel's kings actually come to pass, it's pretty much exactly what God said was going to happen. Specifics for what he mentioned can be found in the lives of King Saul, which we're going to get to in this episode, and King Solomon later on. While the idea that the cost of what a king means in the eyes of men are pretty clear throughout the lineage of those kings in books like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. That was a lot of kings. So we've built all this exposition. Now let's get into who is this Saul character. Chapter 9 will give you the full breakdown of who this guy was and why he was chosen as king. Saul is described here as a choice young man. There was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was taller than any other people. This is evidenced by a few key moments in his early kingship. When we are first introduced to Saul, we see a sense of humility. Saul's origin begins with a quest given by his father, who had lost a pair of donkeys and sent his son and one of his servants to go and look for him. They check out 3 different places, and after being unable to locate these animals, decide that it might be best to just head home before Papa starts to worry. The servant points out, though, before they leave, that there is a certain seer, or prophet, in a nearby town, who is said to be a man of God, a man of honor, and all that he saith comes to pass. He advises that before heading home, they should check with this Samuel fella to see if he might know where the animals are hiding. Saul agrees, but not before saying that they need to bring this prophet a gift. Having spent all of their resources as far as food goes on themselves, they find a few coins in their pockets and decide that that might be enough, and they head into the city. They start asking around town, and they find out that Samuel is indeed in this city, but that if they want to talk to him, they have to catch him just before he, quote, goes up into the high place to bless the sacrifices for the night. Or the sacrifice for the night. I think it's just one. I don't know. At the same time, it is said in the text here that Samuel was given a word of the Lord the day before. That about this time tomorrow, he would send him a man out of the land of Benjamin, who was to be chosen as Israel's king. He would be the one to save God's people out of the hand of the Philistines. Quote, "For I have looked upon my people, because their cry is come unto me." When Samuel steps outside, the Lord again speaks to him, saying, "That's the guy, that's that guy, that's that guy." First thing Samuel asks Saul after introducing himself and telling him that his animals that he's looking for are safe. A notable fact here that Saul didn't even tell Samuel that yet, but he just puts him at ease about this. Anyway, Sam asks him, "On whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on thee and on all of thy father's house?" Meaning essentially, you know how Israel has been asking for a king for a long time, or at least lately? Why shouldn't it be you? Saul is taken aback by this question and points out in verse 21, "Am I not a Benjamite, the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and even then the smallest family within the smallest of said tribes? Why speakest thou to me? Why are you talking to me about it?" This is an interesting response. He doesn't say, "Well, yeah, this makes sense. Look at how impressive I am. Look how tall I am. Look at how handsome I am. This jawline." He doesn't do anything like that. He actually has a similar reaction to Moses becoming leader back in Exodus, carrying this idea that, hold on, man, somebody else has to be a better choice. I'm not that guy. I am not him. I'm not that guy. The important difference to note here, though, is that Saul is being described as Israel's desire. This is not God's. God permits the request to have a king, despite how bad that move will be for the future of their people. What starts as humility in Saul starts to creep towards a sense of insecurity, and that's evidenced as early as when he first gets revealed to the people as their new king. You see, Israel wanted a king that matched the descriptions of the surrounding nations. They wanted tall,
strong,
impressive, tangible. Saul fits those descriptions to a T on the outside. But moments like chapter 10, verses 21 through 23 show the cracks. While he was anointed by Samuel privately back in the high places a chapter ago, when it's time to reveal him to everyone else, Saul is hiding. This checks out to me. This makes sense. It's understandable, okay? Can you imagine the weight that this guy has been feeling on his shoulders at this point? I don't care how tall he is or how broad they are. He was just out looking for animals for his father, and then all of a sudden he's going to be in charge of the entire nation. This feels less like humility and more along the lines of hesitation. And hesitation in leadership, if left unchecked, especially on the scale of leading an entire nation, doesn't stay small for long. Keep in mind too, though, that this weakness isn't demonized in the text, okay? God doesn't care about how small that we are, that we think we are when he first asks us to do something. He cares about how big we are willing to become through him and his power. The text even points out in verse 9 that God gave Saul another heart. He doesn't just get a title and a bunch of resources and respect of the people and a ton of money. Saul becomes a new man. the Spirit of God comes upon him and gives him the strength that he needs for the task ahead. So Saul is a bit rough around the edges here to start, but it's not the end of the world. And he showcases that in the next leg of his first years of being king with the defeat of the Ammonites. In chapter 11, we see the leader of the Ammonites has set up shop outside of Jabesh Gilead. I shouldn't have. Why did I name the cities if I wasn't going to pronounce them right? It's a city in the nation of Israel, okay? Jabesh tells Nahash, who is the leader of Ammon, that he wants peace. And Nahash says, oh, peace. Okay, I'll make peace with you. If you thrust out all of your right eyes and lay them out as a reproach unto all Israel. So the elders of Jabesh Gilead send messengers to all the coasts of Israel, pretty much getting a census on, how cool the people would be with this agreement. And when word gets to where Saul's been hanging out, quote, his anger was kindled greatly. He gathers the people, counts and divides them up into different companies, and they put the whooping on the Ammonites. The people rejoice, and someone mentions to Saul in verse 12, hey, who were those people among us who didn't think Saul should be king? This is alluding to the end of chapter 10, when those who still worshipped Baal did not approve of his kinship. Bring the men that were doing this stuff out, that we may put him to death. But Saul stands firm in the Lord here, and says in verse 13, there shall not a man be put to death this day, for today the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel. Notice how the arc of Saul's reign has started so far. It's been something like this, right? Chapter 10, Saul waits on Samuel to give him the green light. And then chapter 11, Saul gives credit to God when things go well. Strong, standing tall, impressive. For now. Chapter 12 is a bit intense too. This is where Samuel reveals that bit we mentioned earlier regarding his sons being removed from the priesthood, as well as acknowledging that while, yes, Saul has done great so far, Israel cannot forget where that power came from. This idea that you think you need an earthly king to worship and gawk over is still an awful way to go about living. In this chapter, Samuel recaps some important moments where God came through before a king was ever around, moments that shaped the success of what Israel had become as a nation from back in Exodus to this point in the book. He instills this idea that just because things are going good now doesn't mean that they will forever. God hasn't changed, but you might. The moment either you or your king begin to doubt or turn away from God is the moment you will be reminded of just how foolish the decision to have a king at all was in the first place. God then demonstrates his power in verse 18, sending thunder and rain to fall harshly on the wheat which was ready to be harvested that day. A key verse that shows the point of this is shortly after in verse 20. And Samuel said unto the people, fear not, ye have done all this wickedness, yet turn not aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. There it is again, a direct call to the idea that serving with the heart is what is most important when it comes to what God cares about. The chapter ends with a reminder that only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider how great things he hath done for you. But if ye shall still do wickedly, ye shall be consumed, both ye and your king. In chapter 13, we're told that this is now the second year of Saul's reign in Israel. They've just fought a garrison of Philistines, and that was not received well by the rest of them. So Philly sets up camp nearby with a great deal of soldiers ready to strike back. We're told that the men of Israel begin to panic. They scatter from their king, they hide in caves, trembling as they follow Saul to Gilgal, the place where we can assume is being besieged based on the context. We're also told that Samuel instructed Saul to wait for him there for 7 days before anything. Saul obeys, to an extent. The 7th day arrives and Samuel is nowhere to be seen, at least seen by Saul. So Saul then panics and begins offering sacrifices to the Lord in an attempt to appease the people and have a sense of control over the situation.
What?
Here's the hierarchy for Israel so far, just to put it in plain view for yours and mine understanding, okay? God is above all, the prophet is below God, the king is below the prophet, and the people are below the king. When Saul does this sacrifice, he collapses this order that God had established. And when Samuel returns, like a verse after, it's like, it's kind of funny to read, because it almost reads like Saul starts and does the sacrifice immediately, and then Samuel's just like, hello, what are you doing? Like he was just standing there behind a curtain or something. That's not what, I don't know, that's just in my head. When Samuel returns, he reprimands Saul, saying in verse 11, "What hast thou done?" followed by Saul's explanation of his actions. Saul mentions that I forced myself to do this offering because the army was closing in, you didn't arrive when you said you would, and the people were slipping away. Samuel isn't rebuking the sacrifice itself. He's upset because of your lack of patience and trust. If you're being Saul in this conversation, I keep flipping in and out of perspectives. Are you able to follow? Am I able to follow? You kind of just did, Saul, you kind of just did exactly what the Israelites did earlier in 1 Samuel with the Ark of the Covenant. You performing this ritual or tradition as a way to get what you wanted instead of trusting in the God that brought you here. For this, Sam tells Saul that he has done foolishly and not obeyed God, and in the act of not obeying God and his commandments, which if you had done that would have led to your kingdom being upon Israel forever. Now your dynasty is over, Saul. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be the captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. To avoid getting caught in another series of 10-minute long tangents, we'll go ahead and breeze through the next chapter or so that describe how Israel ends up beating the Philistines here. Saul's son, whose name is Jonathan, is a big part of this victory, but to mention him here and not go into depth about what he goes on to do in his own life and in the life of the king after Saul would really be a crime to his character. I just want you to know that Jonathan's great. He's a great guy and stands as another shining example that the sins of the father do not always rub off on the ones that come afterwards. But what I can say that will help paint the picture a bit clearer for us in this section is this. Israel continues to win big here despite Saul's shortcomings. The beginning of chapter 14 depicts to us a scenario in which Jonathan is ready to keep the pressure on the enemy, while Saul is kind of doing his own thing. There aren't many Philistines left after that initial battle, so it appears that Saul is taking a longer than 15-minute lunch break, before getting back to work. Jonathan and his armor bearer slip away from the 600 men that reside with Saul in a part of Gibeah, which is in Migron. You didn't really need to know that, but it's in there, so I put it in there. He says in verse 6, "Come and let us go over into the garrison of the uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few." So this duo, Jonathan and his armor bearer, they wind up killing 20 or so Philistines on their own. And when the rest of the army hears the shouting, they show up to finish the job. Not only the rest of the 600 that was just mentioned, but the text goes on to say that the noise was so loud that even those Israelites who were hiding in nearby caves and towns were attracted to the commotion and added their assistance to help drive out the Philistines too. This section is summed up in verse 23, saying, "So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed over unto Bethaven." The story goes on to say that the men in the army begin feeling distressed due to Saul making this strange vow that nobody was allowed to eat until that very evening. Jonathan isn't in the crowd when that vow was made, so he doesn't hear the instruction and regains his strength by eating some nearby honey, like in between fights or something like that, thereby breaking this oath which stated anyone who ate before nighttime was to be killed. They continue to drive back the Philistines, and as you can imagine, each battle that occurs, the people grow more and more weary due to their exhaustion. Crazy how you have to eat to have energy. And eventually, in verse 32, they begin to take the animals of the enemy into their own hands and break that vow themselves, going a step further and eating of the blood of those animals too. It's really a whole mess due to an impulsive decision on Saul. one that we don't even get a ton of context for in terms of what motivated him to do this. When Saul finds out, he says an oath is an oath and is willing to kill even his own son over this thing, along with all the others who disobeyed him. At this point, he's asked God if he should move in on the Philistines again, to which God doesn't answer him. He tells the priests to help him follow through with this oath, but nobody responds. And I don't know, like Saul is clearly starting to crack under the pressure of being king. That hesitation that we saw earlier is turning into something else. Not humility, but a need for control. In chapter 13, we saw that he couldn't wait on God. And now here in chapter 14, we see that he can't risk losing the people. And when fear starts making decisions for a leader, obedience is usually the first thing that goes out the window. Chapter 15 doesn't come out of nowhere. It stands in the wake of these fears that Saul chooses to lean into. At the start of chapter 15, Samuel gives Saul a direct decree, saying that the Lord remembers what the Amalekites did to Israel in the past, how they laid in wait for them after they were come out of Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, oxen and sheep, camel and ass. Okay, well, what did these guys do to Israel to have such a direct order as this to be given out? Well, there's two passages we can look back to that would answer this question. In Exodus 17, the Amalekites first appear while Israel is on their way out of Egypt. There's a brief section in this chapter that includes some of the complaining we've talked about before, and afterwards, in verses 8 through 13, it talks about how the Israelites were able to overcome this threat. Cool. In the remainder of this chapter, we'll see God telling Moses to write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Here it doesn't appear that this battle is much different from others, aside from a cool moment where it talks about how when Moses has his hands up to raised to God, the people are winning, but when he drops them, they begin to lose. There's probably a whole, theological thing we could do about what that means or what that is, but that's the battle we're talking about if you've heard of that one before. In the second section, this Deuteronomy chapter 25 section, this is where we get in some more details about the engagement itself. Remember the whole book of remembrance after all, But anyway, verses 17 through 19 say the following. Remember what Amalek did unto thee by the way, when you were come forth out of Egypt. How he met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, the back, the most rear of thee, I suppose. Even all that were feeble behind thee, when thou wast faint and weary, and feared not God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord thy God hath given thee rest from all thine enemies round about, in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance to possess it, that thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, and thou shalt not forget it. So this was not your typical run-of-the-mill military battle. Okay, this was a predatory attack on Israel that targeted the tired, the elderly, the women and children, and at the very least, a group of people as a whole who were weary from their time struggling in the wilderness. And maybe struggling in slavery, because this is, if I'm reading this correctly, this is right after they get out of being slaves. They have not had time to train or even get used to what even a wilderness is yet, as far as I can tell. But anyway, notice that this again is not just some random explosion of emotional revenge. Okay, this is a form of drawn out, postponed justice. You'll see the name of Amalek continue to pop up here and there after Deuteronomy, particularly in Judges, signaling too that after Israel beat them once, they didn't take that as a sign to stop, but instead as motivation to constantly harass and attack whenever they could. This was not about military revenge, but about ending a cycle of predatory violence that had persisted for generations. By the time we get to Samuel, this is a promise that the people of Israel would have been looking forward to, another demonstration of God keeping his promises. While it's easy and accurate to say that during this time period in history as a whole, Complete and utter annihilation of nations wasn't uncommon. That ending generational lines was something people did all the time to prevent future generations from causing problems with, well, other future generations. It doesn't make it any easier to digest the events that we read about in this passage, okay? Like, this is one of the hardest and heaviest passages in the Old Testament. I don't have to go into the details that I've already done in previous episodes, defending a loving God while describing how he decides judgment should be executed, but I will say this. God does not take pleasure in the death of any man, wicked or otherwise. Scripture consistently shows judgment at the end of long patience, not at the beginning of anger. There's a handful of verses in Ezekiel 18 that talk about how he has no pleasure in the death of him that dieth, wherefore turn yourselves and live ye. A sentiment that is again repeated in Ezekiel 33. And another one that comes to mind is much later in 2 Peter 3:9, where it says, "The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance." God chooses to love, but God's love does not cancel his justice. His patience does not erase his promises. So when we bring this back to Samuel 15, right? We're back now. Are you still awake? When we bring this back to Samuel 15, and God is giving Saul a direct order to fulfill his promise to the people, this is not just another task that can be done halfway. This is an incredibly heavy instruction that demands complete obedience. And dude, like, Saul is a Benjamite, remember from like 20 minutes ago? He is not a random stranger that wouldn't have known the gravity of the situation. Chill. We're not even there yet. Okay. No, you're right. I'll chill. I'll chill. Saul begins the assault, even going as far as telling another group of people residing in a land nearby, that of the Kenites, to get out of Dodge, as to not be swept up in the chaos. But I probably didn't have to mention that, but I thought it was kind of cool. That, like, he could have just, anyway. In verses 7 through 9, it says that Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah unto thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatlings, and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. We see here that instead of obeying what was commanded, and being part of the fulfillment of the promise made of old, Saul decided to obey just enough to look faithful on the outside. Just enough to leave little doubt in the people he ruled over to question his conviction and faith. Just enough to be rinsed, not enough to be clean. Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, verse 11, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he has turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. So close. Saul was so close to doing what was asked of him. He was so close to justifying Israel's demand for an earthly king, or to he was so close to making Samuel's warning feel like nothing. Samuel and God's warning feel like it was unwarranted. But in the end, Saul chose to do things his own way. And what does God do? Does he send fire down from heaven on Saul for his disobedience? Does he make his heart stop dead on the spot? Nope. God grieves. He could have overridden Saul. He could have intervened. He could have ensured obedience, but he doesn't. Nope. Because this God that we keep on reading about cares about choice. He gives warnings, he gives patience, he gives opportunities, and sometimes he gives us what we insist on having. And when we misuse what he permitted, it doesn't make him any less sovereign. It makes him grieved. Does God feel pain? Yes, he does. Not because he is weak, but because he loves. Thank you for watching. I hope you get something out of this. We'll see you back here next week, where we'll be examining another layer of this pain through the prophet Ezekiel. Take care of yourself. I love you. See ya.